He was 18 years old when he inherited a forgotten building for $7. What he and his sister discovered inside would change not only their lives, but the fate of an entire town. If you've ever felt lost and wondered if there was a place for you in this world, hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you. The door to the group home clicked shut behind me with the sound of a well-oiled lock. A final metallic punctuation mark on 18 years of institutional life. It wasn't a slam, it was worse. It was a quiet, indifferent closing, the sound of a file being placed in a cabinet, a case being marked complete. My sister Maya stood beside me on the cracked concrete step, her shoulders set in a line so rigid it looked like it might snap. She was 19, aged out a year before me, but she'd stayed in the transitional housing unit attached to the home, waiting for me. Now, the waiting was over. We were officially untethered, two small satellites knocked out of a predictable, sterile orbit, hurtling into the vast, cold unknown. We each had one duffel bag. Mine was navy blue, hers was a faded black. Inside were the curated scraps of a childhood owned by the state. A few sets of clothes, a worn paperback copy of a book I'd read a dozen times, a photo of our parents, young, smiling, strangers, and a stack of paperwork that declared us legally adult, legally responsible, legally on our own. The air, thick with the damp chill of a late autumn morning, felt thin in my lungs. I watched my breath plume in front of my face, a temporary ghost. "Well," Maya said, her voice carefully neutral. "That's that." I just nodded, my throat too tight to form words. For years, turning 18 had been a beacon, a shimmering promise of freedom. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, walking out with my head held high, music in my ears, the entire world laid out before me like a map. The reality was this: a profound and terrifying silence, the rumble of distant traffic, and the weight of my duffel bag strap cutting into my shoulder. We had $412 between us, the last of the stipends and money saved from her part-time job at a diner. Enough for a week in a motel, maybe 2 if we ate nothing but instant noodles. Then what? The question hung in the air between us, unspoken and enormous. Ms. Albright, our case manager for the last 5 years, had pulled me aside yesterday for our final transition meeting. She was a good woman, tired around the eyes, but with a genuine warmth that was rare in the system. She'd handed me a thick manila envelope, sealed and heavy. "This is from your grandfather's estate, Leo," she'd said, her voice soft. "It was left in trust until your 18th birthday. It's not much, I'm afraid. In fact, it's probably more of a liability." I remembered my grandfather only in flashes. The smell of sawdust and old paper, big calloused hands that could fix anything. A low, rumbling laugh. He'd died when I was 11, a sudden heart attack that had been the first domino to fall in the long, slow collapse of our family. Our parents had followed 2 years later, a car crash on a slick winter road. Then came the system. The envelope felt like a message from another lifetime. Now, standing on the curb, with the imposing brick building of our past at our backs, and a future that was a complete and utter void, it felt like the only thing we had left. Maya looked at me, her dark eyes searching mine. "What's in the envelope, Leo?" I shifted the duffel bag on my shoulder and pulled it from the inside pocket of my jacket. It was addressed to Leo and Maya Vance in a spidery, elegant script I vaguely recognized as his. My fingers trembled slightly as I tore open the seal. Inside wasn't a check or a savings bond or any of the things I'd secretly, foolishly hoped for. It was a single, folded sheet of brittle, yellowed paper and a heavy, old-fashioned iron key. The key was ornate, almost medieval, its teeth a complex pattern of squares and notches. The paper was a deed, a quitclaim deed dated a few months before his death. It transferred ownership of a property, listed only by a parcel number and a street address in a town I'd never heard of called Oakhaven, to Maya and me. The sale price listed on the document made my breath catch. $7. $7? Maya whispered, leaning in to read over my shoulder. He sold it to us for $7? What is it? I scanned the dense block of legal text. It looks like a warehouse, Lot 4B, industrial sector, Oakhaven. I looked at Ms. Albright's attached note, a quick professional summary. She said it's been abandoned for years, delinquent on property taxes. The city could seize it any day. A liability, that's what she'd called it. A rusted-out money pit in a forgotten town. A cruel joke from a dead man. I felt a surge of bitter disappointment, so sharp it tasted like acid. This was our inheritance? A bill? A problem? I almost crumpled it in my fist. But then I looked at the key. It was solid, real. It was a key to a door. And a door, any door, felt like a better option than no door at all. Maya must have seen the shift on my face. She touched my arm, her fingers cool against my skin. "Where is Oakhaven?" she asked, her voice no longer neutral, but laced with a fragile thread of something I hadn't heard in a long time. Hope. I pulled out my phone, my hands clumsy with cold, and typed the name into the map. It was 200 miles away, a 4-hour bus ride into the state's forgotten heartland. A tiny dot surrounded by miles of green and gray. We looked at each other. The bus station was a 10-block walk. The tickets would cost us nearly $80. It was a stupid, reckless gamble. It was the only plan we had. The bus station was a monument to transient despair. The air smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. Every surface was sticky. People sat slumped in the hard plastic chairs, their faces etched with the kind of exhaustion that goes bone deep. They were either running from something or running toward something. And I realized with a jolt that Maya and I were now one of them. We bought 2 one-way tickets to Oakhaven and spent the last of our loose change on 2 styrofoam cups of burnt-tasting coffee from a vending machine. We found a pair of seats by a grimy window and sat in silence, the manila envelope resting on my lap like a sacred text. The minutes stretched into an hour. We didn't talk. There was nothing to say that wasn't already screaming in the space between us. The fear was a living thing, a cold knot in my stomach. I kept rereading the deed, as if the dense legalese held a hidden meaning, a secret escape clause from our reality. Parcel 4B, industrial sector. It sounded less like a place and more like a line item on a spreadsheet, a rounding error in a forgotten municipal budget. Why would our grandfather leave us this? The man I remembered, however faintly, was kind. He built things. He didn't saddle children with debt and dereliction. It didn't make sense. "Maybe it's a mistake," I said finally, the words raspy. "Maybe," Maya agreed, not looking at me. She was staring out the window at the endless parade of buses, their diesel fumes staining the gray morning air. Or maybe he had a reason. Maya had always been the pragmatist, the one who saw the world in stark, unblinking terms. Her flicker of hope from earlier seemed to have been extinguished by the grim reality of our surroundings. I, on the other hand, was the dreamer, the one who'd always looked for meaning, for stories. It was a habit the system had tried its best to break, but it was still there, a stubborn ember. I thought about the number, $7. He died 7 years after our parents. No, that wasn't right. He died 2 years before them. I was 11. Maya was 12. So it had been 7 years since he died. The number felt deliberate, symbolic, a message only we might understand. I picked up the heavy iron key. It was cold to the touch. The design was intricate, a far cry from the simple, mass-produced keys we'd used our whole lives. This key felt like it belonged to a different century. It promised nothing, but it was tangible. It was proof that somewhere in the world there was a lock that we were meant to open. A place, however broken, that was ours. That thought was so foreign, so radical, it was almost painful to consider. For 18 years, every room I'd slept in, every plate I'd eaten from, every book I'd read belonged to someone else. The idea of ours was an abstraction, a word from a language I didn't speak. The call for our bus crackled over the intercom, a distorted, robotic voice summoning us to Gate 12. We stood up in unison, shouldering our bags. The weight felt different now. It was still the weight of all our worldly possessions, but it was also the weight of a choice. We were no longer just being pushed by the system. We were pulling ourselves towards something. As we shuffled in line with the other passengers, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was accompanied by a sharp, clear sense of purpose. We were heading into the unknown, armed with a key, a deed to a ruin, and a nonsensical purchase price. It was insane. It was terrifying. And for the first time since that door clicked shut, it felt like a beginning. The bus ride was a 4-hour journey through a decaying postcard of America. We left the city behind, the concrete and steel giving way to sprawling suburbs, then to patchy farmland, and finally to dense, dark forests of pine and oak. The towns we passed through grew smaller and farther apart, their main streets lined with shuttered storefronts and peeling paint. This was the part of the state that prosperity had forgotten, a place where time seemed to move more slowly, or perhaps had stopped altogether. Maya slept for most of the ride, her head resting against the cool glass of the window, her face peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in years. I stayed awake, watching the world slide by, feeling like we were traveling backward in time. Oakhaven didn't have a station. The bus just pulled over on the side of a 2-lane road next to a rusted sign that read, "Welcome to Oakhaven, population 1,243. The driver grunted, "This is it," and opened the door with a pneumatic hiss. We were the only ones who got off. The bus pulled away, its red taillights shrinking in the distance, leaving us in a profound and unnerving quiet. The air was different here. It was clean and sharp, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. The sky was a vast, unbroken sheet of gray. The town, from what we could see, was nestled in a shallow valley, a small collection of buildings huddled together against the encroaching wilderness. We were on the outskirts, in what was generously labeled the industrial sector. It was a ghost of a place. A few crumbling brick buildings, their windows like vacant eyes, stood sentinel over cracked and weed-choked asphalt lots. A single railroad track, rusted and silent, cut through the landscape. There was no one around, no cars, no signs of life. It felt like we'd been dropped onto a movie set after the crew had packed up and gone home. According to the map on my phone, the address on the deed was just a 1/4 of a mile down the road. We started walking, the crunch of our boots on the gravel shoulder the only sound. The silence was unnerving. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel watched. Every gust of wind, rattling a loose piece of sheet metal on a nearby roof, sounded like a footstep. And then we saw it. It wasn't hard to spot. It was the biggest building on the street, a colossal structure of corrugated metal, its surface a mottled patchwork of rust and faded gray paint. It loomed over the road, squat and imposing, more of a fortress than a warehouse. A chain-link fence, sagging and topped with withered coils of barbed wire, surrounded the property. The gate was held shut by a thick, rusty chain and a heavy-duty padlock that looked like it had been there for decades. This was it. Lot 4B, our inheritance. Maya stopped, her duffel bag slipping from her shoulder to the ground with a soft thud. "Oh, Leo," she breathed, and the two words were filled with a universe of despair. It was worse than I had imagined. It wasn't just abandoned, it was derelict. It looked like it was actively decaying, being slowly consumed by the relentless forces of nature. Weeds grew in thick clumps around its foundation. A large section of the roof had a noticeable sag. One of the huge bay doors was dented inward, as if something enormous had tried to smash its way in. It was a wreck, a tomb. Ms. Albright was right. It was a liability. A tear of hot frustration pricked my eye. I'd let myself believe, just for a few hours, that this could be something, an escape, a chance. Seeing it now, in the flesh, felt like a punch to the gut. The dream evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of our foolishness. We had spent more than a third of our money to come to this place, to claim this pile of junk. "Let's just go," Maya said, her voice flat. "We can try to hitch a ride back to somewhere." But I couldn't move. I was staring at the padlock on the gate. It was a big, modern-looking lock, not the kind of thing that would have been here for years. It was new. Someone had been here recently. I walked over to the gate, my boots crunching on the gravel. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old iron key. It was a long shot, a ridiculous one. The key was ornate, antique. The lock was a standard master lock. They were from different worlds, different centuries. But as I brought the key closer, I saw it. Not the padlock. The gate itself had another, much older locking mechanism built into the post, almost completely obscured by rust and grime. It was a heavy iron box with a keyhole that was the exact shape of my key. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I scraped away some of the rust with my fingernail, revealing the dark metal beneath. I slid the key into the lock. It was stiff, resistant. I had to jiggle it, push it with all my strength. For a second, nothing happened. I was about to give up, to concede to the hopelessness of it all. Then, with a deep, groaning click that seemed to echo in the silence, the lock turned. The internal mechanism, frozen for years, had released. The heavy chain, secured only by the new padlock, was just a decoy. The real lock was the one our grandfather had left. The gate was ours to open. I looked back at Maya. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly agape. The despair on her face had been replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. The hope I'd thought was extinguished had been rekindled, and this time it was burning brighter. We hadn't just found a way in. We had found the right key. And that, in our world, was everything. The gate groaned open on protesting hinges, the sound of metal screaming after years of silence. We slipped through the gap, and I pulled it shut behind us. the latch clicking back into place. We were inside. The feeling was electric, a strange mix of trespassing and homecoming. The ground crunched under our feet, a mixture of gravel and shattered glass. We walked toward the main building, our steps slow and deliberate, as if approaching a sleeping giant. A smaller door was set into the massive, corrugated wall next to the dented bay door. It had a similar, ancient-looking lock. My hands were shaking now, but the key slid in more easily this time. Another turn, another heavy, satisfying clunk. I put my shoulder to the door and pushed. It resisted, metal scraping against a warped frame. Maya joined me, and together we shoved with all our weight. With a final, shuddering groan, the door gave way, swinging inward into darkness. We stood on the threshold, peering into the gloom. The air that washed over us was thick and cold, carrying the scent of dust, damp concrete, and something else. Something metallic and oily, the ghost of industry. It was the smell of my grandfather's workshop, a scent I hadn't realized I remembered until that exact moment. It hit me with the force of a physical blow, a memory unlocked, just like the door. Maya grabbed my arm. "Do you have a light?" I pulled out my phone and switched on the flashlight. The beam cut a bright, narrow cone through the darkness, illuminating a universe of dust motes dancing in the air. I stepped inside, Maya close behind me. The space was immense, cavernous. The flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by the sheer scale of it. High above, a skeletal framework of steel beams crisscrossed in the gloom, disappearing into a ceiling we couldn't see. The floor was concrete, stained and cracked, littered with debris. We walked forward, our footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out shapes in the darkness. Long, heavy workbenches stood like silent altars against the far wall. Hulking pieces of machinery, shrouded in tarps and decades of dust, sat like sleeping beasts. Stacks of wooden crates were piled high in one corner, their contents a mystery. It was a place of work, a place of creation, frozen in time. "He was a machinist," I whispered, the memories surfacing. "And an inventor." Maya nodded, her face illuminated in the glow of my phone. "I remember. He was always tinkering. Mom said he could build a car out of scrap metal if he had to." We made our way deeper into the warehouse, the single beam of light our only guide. It was cold, the kind of deep, penetrating cold that settles into old, empty buildings. But it was also still, peaceful. It felt safe, sealed off from the world we'd just left. For the first time in as long as I could remember, there were no other people. No supervisors, no caseworkers, no strangers in the next bunk over. There was just the silence, the dust, and the ghosts of our grandfather's work. In the back corner of the main floor, we found it. A small door, different from the others. It was made of solid wood, with a small, grimy window of reinforced glass set into it. It looked like an office, and it was locked. This lock was different, too. A standard, modern deadbolt. The old iron key wouldn't work here. My heart sank. We had come this far, only to be stopped by a $10 piece of hardware. Maya, ever the pragmatist, was already running her hands along the frame. "It's an old door," she said. "The wood around the lock is soft." She pulled a multi-tool from a side pocket of her duffel bag, a gift from a shop teacher who'd seen her potential. She flipped out a small, flathead screwdriver. "Let's see what we can see." For 10 minutes, she worked at the lock, her brow furrowed in concentration. The only sounds were the faint scraping of metal on metal and our own ragged breaths. I held the light steady, watching her delicate, precise movements. Finally, with a small, sharp pop, the bolt slid back. The door swung open. The office was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. It contained a single metal desk, a rusted filing cabinet, and a wooden chair that looked like it would collapse if you sat on it. The air was stale, thick with the smell of old paper. Everything was covered in a layer of dust, so thick it looked like a blanket of gray snow. But on the center of the desk, wiped clean in a perfect circle, sat a metal box. It was an old Army surplus ammunition can, painted olive drab, with a heavy latch on the front. It didn't have a lock, just the latch. And sitting on top of the can was a single, small brass key. A key for a filing cabinet. My breath caught in my chest. This was it. This was what he'd left for us. This felt deliberate. The outer locks, opened by his key, led us here. The office door, a simple barrier to be overcome by ingenuity. And now this, a final set of clues. I handed the flashlight to Maya and picked up the ammo can. It was heavy. I placed it on the floor, my fingers fumbling with the cold metal latch. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed foam padding, were two things. The first was a thick stack of envelopes, bound together with a faded blue ribbon. They were addressed in my grandfather's familiar script. One said, "Leo, for your 18th birthday." The other, "Maya, for your 19th birthday." The rest were marked with dates, stretching back years. The second thing in the box was a smaller, lacquered wooden box. It was beautiful, inlaid with mother of pearl. It was locked with a tiny, intricate lock. There was no key. Maya had already moved to the filing cabinet. The small brass key slid into the top drawer's lock and turned with a quiet click. She pulled the drawer open. It was empty, except for a single, small, velvet pouch. She opened it and tipped the contents into her palm. It was another key, a tiny, ornate silver key, the kind you might find for a jewelry box. It was the key to the wooden box. It was a puzzle, a trail of breadcrumbs left for us, and only us, to follow. We had followed it to its heart. We sat down on the dusty floor of the tiny office, the single beam of the flashlight creating a small, intimate circle of light in the vast, dark warehouse, our home. Maya handed me my stack of letters. I untied the ribbon. The first one was thick. My hands were trembling as I opened it. The letter began, "My dearest Leo, if you are reading this, then I am long gone, and you have finally come of age, and you have found your way home." I read the first letter aloud, my voice thick with emotion, the words filling the small, dusty office. Maya sat beside me, her arm pressed against mine, a silent, solid presence in the dark. My grandfather's voice, silent for 7 years, emerged from the page. A voice I'd only known as a child, now speaking to me as a man. "My dearest Leo," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am long gone, and you have finally come of age, and you have found your way home. I know this place must seem like a ruin to you, a burden. I'm sorry for that. But I need you to understand that this warehouse, this pile of rust and memories, is the most important thing I have to leave you. It is not an inheritance, it is a fortress." He went on to explain. After our parents died, he had tried to get custody of us. He'd fought for months, spending every penny he had on lawyers. But the system had deemed him too old, his income too unstable, his workshop, this warehouse, an unsuitable environment for two grieving children. They saw a tinkerer, a scrap metal artist, not a guardian. He had lost. And in his grief and anger, he had become paranoid. He wrote about our parents' accident, and the story he told was not the one we knew. It wasn't just a patch of black ice on a winter night. Our father, a brilliant but struggling chemical engineer, had been working on a new, low-cost water filtration system. He was on the verge of a breakthrough, one that would have provided clean water cheaply to communities that desperately needed it. But his research was a direct threat to a major corporation that was planning a massive, lucrative development in the region. A development that relied on selling bottled water and expensive municipal filtration contracts. That corporation was Apex Urban Development. "Your father was offered a buyout," my grandfather wrote. "They wanted his patents, his research. They offered him a fortune to walk away and keep quiet. He refused. He believed his work belonged to the world, not to a boardroom. A week later, he and your mother were gone. The police called it an accident. No witnesses. Case closed. I never believed it. I believed they were silenced. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the page. Maya let out a choked sob beside me. The story of our lives, the simple, tragic narrative we'd been given, was a lie. A neat, tidy fabrication to cover up something monstrous. Our parents weren't just victims of fate. They were casualties of greed. My grandfather wrote that after their deaths, he became obsessed with protecting us and protecting our father's work. He liquidated all his assets and poured the money into this warehouse, reinforcing it, turning it into a vault. He knew Apex would eventually come for our father's research, and he suspected they'd come for us too, once we were old enough to legally inherit what our father had left behind. The warehouse was his desperate, last-ditch effort to give us a sanctuary, a place off the grid where we could be safe and, when the time was right, find the truth. "Everything you need is here, Leo," the letter concluded. "Your father's legacy is hidden within these walls. The real inheritance isn't this building, but what it protects. Be smart. Be careful. Trust no one but your sister. The key to the wooden box will show you the start. I love you, Grandpa." I finished reading, and the silence that followed was heavy, profound. The dust motes dancing in the flashlight beam seemed to be the only things moving in the entire universe. I looked at Maya. Tears were streaming down her face, silent and steady. She wasn't just crying for our parents, or for the grandfather we barely got to know. She was crying for the years we'd lost, for the truth that had been stolen from us. I felt a cold, hard knot of anger forming in my chest. It was a clean, pure rage that burned away the fear and confusion. Our lives hadn't been a series of random tragedies. They had been shaped by a deliberate, calculated act of evil. We weren't just orphans, we were survivors. I picked up the small, ornate silver key. It was delicate, almost fragile, but it felt like the heaviest thing I had ever held. It was the key to the next part of the story. I fitted it into the lock on the lacquered wooden box. It turned with a tiny, precise click. I lifted the lid. Inside, on a bed of faded red velvet, was not a trove of documents or a map. It was a single, thick roll of $100 bills held together by a rubber band. And beneath it, a small, hand-drawn schematic, a floor plan of the warehouse. On the floor plan, in the far southwest corner, a small section of the concrete floor was marked with a red X. Beside it, my grandfather had written a single word: hope. We counted the money. It was $10,000. Enough to live on for months, enough to make a stand. It was seed money, It was a lifeline. But it was the map that held our attention. We took the ammo can and the schematic and left the office, our flashlight beam cutting a path back into the main cavern of the warehouse. We found the southwest corner easily. It was a section of the floor partially hidden behind a stack of old, empty oil drums. The concrete looked no different from the rest of the floor, cracked and stained with age. But as I ran my hand over the surface, I felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible seam in the shape of a perfect square, about 3 feet by 3 feet. It was a hidden hatch, so skillfully set into the floor that it was practically invisible. There was no handle, no ring to pull. But on the schematic, next to the X, was a small diagram showing a specific brick in the nearby wall. It was a loose brick, designed to be removed. Behind it, there would be a lever. It was like something out of a book, a secret passage in a castle. But this was real. I found the brick easily enough. It wiggled when I pushed it. I worked my fingers into the crumbling mortar and pulled it free. Reaching into the dark, cold cavity, my fingers brushed against a smooth iron rod. The lever. I took a deep breath and pulled it down. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low, grinding sound of stone on stone, the square section of the floor began to rise. 1 inch, then 2. It was a pressure-activated hydraulic system, ancient and ingenious. It lifted just enough for us to get our fingers underneath. Together, Maya and I heaved the concrete slab upwards. It was incredibly heavy, but it lifted on a set of counterweighted hinges, swinging open to reveal a dark, square hole in the ground. A ladder made of iron rebar descended into the blackness. The air that rose from the opening was cool and dry, smelling of earth and paper. This was it. This was the vault. This was our father's legacy. This was hope. The space below was a small, dry cellar, no bigger than the office above. The walls were reinforced concrete, the air still and silent. In the center of the room sat a large military-style footlocker, and next to it, several waterproof, sealed document tubes. It was a time capsule, a legacy in waiting. We spent the next several hours in that hidden room, poring over the contents by the light of our phones. The footlocker contained our father's life's work, notebook after notebook, filled with his elegant, precise handwriting, chemical formulas, diagrams, and calculations. There were prototypes of his filtration system, small, intricate devices made of ceramic and carefully wound copper wire. It was the work of a genius, a man who had been on the verge of changing the world. The document tubes held the legal papers, patents, copyrights, incorporation documents for a small, independent research company he had started, and a last will and testament we had never seen. In it, he left everything, his research, his patents, his company, to us. It was all legally, indisputably ours. We were not just the owners of a derelict warehouse. We were the owners of an idea that was powerful enough to get our parents killed. As the weight of this discovery settled on us, another, more immediate reality began to sink in. We were sitting on a secret that a massive, powerful corporation had murdered to protect. And now, they knew we existed. This realization came with a new wave of fear, colder and sharper than before. It wasn't the abstract fear of being homeless and alone anymore. This was a specific, targeted fear. We were no longer just 2 kids who had fallen through the cracks. We were a threat. My grandfather had understood that. His letters were a warning as much as they were a comfort. He had built this fortress to protect us, but fortresses are meant to withstand sieges, and we had a feeling the siege was about to begin. The next morning, as the first weak rays of dawn filtered through the grimy upper windows of the warehouse, casting long, dusty shafts of light across the concrete floor. The spell of the night's discoveries began to wear off, replaced by the harsh glare of practicalities. We were in a cold, dark building with no electricity, no running water, and $10,000 that suddenly felt like a very small shield against a very large dragon. We were exhausted, emotionally and physically. But we were also buzzing with a nervous energy, a sense of purpose that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Our first priority was survival. We needed to make this place livable, or at least tenable. We used some of the cash to buy supplies from the small, sleepy town's only hardware store. The owner, a grizzled man named Mr. Henderson, with paint on his overalls and a skeptical look in his eyes, watched us load up a cart with heavy-duty cleaning supplies, flashlights, batteries, work gloves, and a small propane camping stove. "Big project you got there," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Something like that," Maya replied, her tone non-committal. He eyed us for a moment longer. "You're the Vance kids, aren't you? Heard you were in town. That old warehouse, it's been empty a long time." The news of our arrival had apparently traveled fast in a town of 1,200 people. I just nodded, not wanting to engage. "Trust no one," my grandfather had said. For the next week, we worked. We worked until our muscles ached and our hands were raw. We swept away years of dust and grime. We scrubbed the small office until it was habitable. We boarded up the broken windows and patched the most obvious leaks in the roof with tar. We set up a small living area in one corner of the main floor with 2 sleeping bags, our camp stove, and a cooler. It was bleak and Spartan, but it was ours. We were building a life, scrap by scrap, in the shell of our grandfather's fortress. Each small act of cleaning and repair felt like an act of defiance, a way of reclaiming the space and, by extension, ourselves. During a break one afternoon, as we sat eating canned soup heated on the stove, Maya looked around at the vast, shadowy space. "You know," she said, "it's starting to feel less like a tomb." I knew what she meant. The oppressive weight of the place was lifting, replaced by the faint echo of our own presence. It was no longer just a repository of the past. It was becoming the site of our future. The letter arrived on the 8th day. It wasn't delivered by a mail carrier. The place didn't have a functioning mailbox. A courier in a crisp, unmarked van drove up to the gate and affixed a waterproof document envelope to the fence. I watched him from a grimy window, my heart pounding. The envelope was addressed to the current occupants of Parcel 4B. It was from the legal department of Apex Urban Development. The tone of the letter was cold, corporate, and utterly devoid of humanity. It stated that they were aware the property had recently been transferred. It acknowledged the significant back taxes owed to the city. And then it made an offer. They were prepared to purchase the property from us for $50,000, cash. They would also settle the outstanding tax debt directly with the municipality. All we had to do was sign the enclosed papers and vacate the premises within 30 days. $50,000. To us, it was a fortune. It was more money than we had ever seen in our lives. It was a ticket out, a clean slate. We could take that money, disappear, and start a new life somewhere far away from Oakhaven, far away from Apex, far away from the ghosts that lived in this building. Maya read the letter over my shoulder, her breath catching. 50,000, she whispered. Leo, we could get an apartment, a real one. We could go to community college. We could be normal. Her voice was full of a desperate, painful longing for a life we'd never had. And I understood it. I felt it too. The temptation was immense, a siren song promising warmth and safety and an end to the struggle. For a few dizzying moments, I let myself imagine it. A small, clean apartment with hot water and soft beds. No more sleeping on the concrete floor. No more eating soup out of a can. No more fear. It was an easy door to walk through. But then I looked around the warehouse. I looked at the clean patch of floor that was our kitchen, at the boarded-up window that was our handiwork. I thought of my grandfather's letters, of my father's notebooks hidden in the cellar below. I thought of their faces, smiling and young in the one faded photograph we owned. $50,000 was the price of our silence. It was the price of their legacy. It was the price of letting them win. "It's hush money, Maya," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "They're not buying a warehouse. They're buying our father's research. They're burying it for good." "But what can we do?" she cried, her pragmatism cracking under the strain. "We're two kids with $10,000 against a massive corporation. They killed them, Leo. What do you think they'll do to us if we fight them?" Her fear was valid. It was rational. But something inside me had shifted. The anger I'd felt reading my grandfather's letter had solidified into a cold, hard resolve. They had taken everything from us, our parents, our childhood, our history. I would not let them take our future, too. "I don't know what we can do," I said, meeting her terrified gaze. "But we can't run. If we take this money, we'll be running for the rest of our lives. This is the only place we have a chance to stand and fight. Grandpa gave us this place. Dad gave us a reason. We can't just sell it for a security deposit on an apartment." We stood there in the echoing silence of the warehouse, the letter from Apex, a white flag of surrender in my hand. The choice was clear, and it was brutal. The easy wrong or the harder right. Safety or justice. Forgetting or remembering. Maya searched my face, her own expression a war of fear and hope. I could see the desire for normalcy battling with the loyalty she felt to our family, to me. Finally, she took a deep breath, the fight seeming to drain out of her, replaced by a weary resignation that was somehow stronger than her fear. She nodded, a single, sharp movement. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, Leo. We fight." That night I took the offer letter from Apex, walked it over to our small camp stove, and watched it burn until it was nothing but a pile of gray ash. Our decision to stay was a quiet declaration of war, and the first battle was against the building itself. Winter was coming, and the warehouse was a sieve. The cold was a physical presence seeping through the metal walls and the cracked concrete floor. Our $10,000 began to dwindle at an alarming rate as we paid for the most urgent repairs. We hired a local electrician, a taciturn man named Sal, to assess the wiring. He spent a day tracing ancient, cloth-wrapped cables and shaking his head. "This is a fire trap," he declared. "To get it up to code, you're looking at a full rewire. Tens of thousands of dollars." We couldn't afford that. Flipped the switch, and a single bare bulb flickered to life above our desk. Maya and I cheered like we'd won the lottery. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It was our light in the darkness. Next came water. The pipes were shot, frozen and burst in a dozen places. But my grandfather, ever the planner, had installed a deep-water well on the property, complete with a manual hand pump. For the first few weeks, we hauled buckets of icy water back and forth. It was grueling, back-breaking work. But then, using the last of our initial funds, We bought a small, modern electric pump, and with the help of a YouTube tutorial and a lot of trial and error, managed to connect it to the wellhead. We ran a flexible hose into the office, where we set up a rudimentary sink. The first time I turned the tap and clean, cold water gushed out, I almost cried. Light. Water. We had the basics of life. We were learning to be resilient, to be resourceful. We learned to patch metal siding, to mix concrete, to frame a small, insulated room within the larger space to serve as our bedroom, a warm pocket in the vast cold. The warehouse was our teacher, and its lessons were harsh but effective. It was forcing us to become the people my grandfather had hoped we would be, self-sufficient, capable, and tough. Our presence did not go unnoticed. The courier from Apex returned, this time with a more aggressive letter. Our 30-day window had passed. The offer was still on the table, but it was now framed with thinly veiled threats about legal action over the tax delinquency. They were trying to intimidate us, to squeeze us out. We ignored it. A few days later, a sleek black car with tinted windows began parking on the street outside our gate for hours at a time. It never approached. No one ever got out. It just sat there, a silent, ominous reminder that we were being watched. It was unnerving, but we refused to show fear. We just kept working, our faces set and determined whenever we were outside. We were not just occupants anymore. We were defenders. The town of Oakhaven watched us too, but with a different kind of curiosity. Mr. Henderson at the hardware store started giving us discounts, slipping extra boxes of screws or a can of sealant into our orders with a gruff, "You'll need this." The waitress at the town's only diner, a woman named Carol with a tired smile and kind eyes, would always pack us extra food when we came in for a cheap meal, sliding a couple of muffins or a slice of pie into our bag. "You two are too skinny," she'd say, waving away our attempts to pay. They were small gestures, but they were lifelines. They were cracks of light in the wall of isolation we had built around ourselves. They saw two kids fighting against impossible odds. And in this forgotten town, where everyone was fighting their own quiet battles against economic decay and indifference, they seemed to recognize a kindred spirit. They didn't ask questions. They didn't pry into our history. They just offered a simple, unspoken solidarity that was more valuable than any amount of money. One afternoon, a woman I recognized as the town clerk showed up at our gate. She was holding a thick file. My first instinct was panic. She was here about the back taxes. This was it. They were seizing the property. But her expression wasn't severe. It was sympathetic. "I'm Martha," she said. "I was a friend of your grandfather's. He was a good man, stubborn as a mule, but good." She explained that my grandfather had set up a special arrangement with the town before he died. He'd prepaid a portion of the taxes for years in advance, creating a buffer. While the account was now officially delinquent, the town charter had a provision for historic family properties, allowing for a grace period and a payment plan, especially for direct descendants. Apex's lawyers in the city either didn't know about the local ordinance, or, more likely, were hoping we didn't. "They've been calling my office every day," Martha said, her lips thinning with distaste, "trying to pressure me to expedite the foreclosure. I told them the Vance property is a local matter, and we'll handle it our own way." She opened the file and showed us a payment plan. It was manageable, barely, but it was possible. It bought us time. It was another piece of our grandfather's fortress, a legal bulwark he had constructed years ago. He had anticipated this fight. He had armed us not just with a building and a secret, but with a community that remembered him, a community that was, however cautiously, starting to embrace us. As Martha left, I looked at Maya. The constant fear and strain on her face had been replaced by a glimmer of something new. It wasn't just hope anymore. It was fight. "They think we're just a couple of dumb kids," she said, a hard edge to her voice. "They have no idea who they're dealing with." Months bled into one another. The harsh winter gave way to a damp, muddy spring, and then to a hot, humid summer. The warehouse, once our enemy, had become our ally. We knew its every groan and creak, the way the light fell at different times of day, the rhythm of its settling. We had transformed a corner of it into a true home. We had a bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living area with 2 salvaged armchairs we'd found at the town dump and painstakingly repaired. We even had internet, a satellite connection that was our window to the outside world. And we were using that window to learn. We spent our nights in the hidden cellar, our father's notebooks spread out before us. Maya, who had always had a knack for science and math, was a natural. She devoured the complex equations and chemical diagrams, her mind lighting up in a way I'd never seen before. She was brilliant, and for the first time in her life, she had something worthy of her intellect. I focused on the business side, reading up on patent law, intellectual property rights, and corporate structures. We were a team, each of us finding our strengths, our roles in this strange new life. We were no longer just Leo and Maya, the orphans from the system. We were the keepers of the flame, the guardians of our father's legacy. We realized that Apex didn't just want the patents to bury them. Our father's research wasn't just about a simple water filter. It was a revolutionary process of water remediation. It could neutralize industrial pollutants in groundwater on a massive scale, cheaply and efficiently. Apex's planned development, we discovered through online county records, was a massive luxury housing and resort complex. And it was slated to be built on a huge tract of land downstream from a cluster of old, leaking factories. Factories that Apex's parent company had owned for decades. They hadn't just covered up a murder. They were planning to build a paradise on top of a toxic wasteland, and our father's invention was the one thing that could expose their lie and render their entire multi-billion-dollar project worthless. The stakes were so much higher than we had ever imagined. This wasn't just about justice for our parents. It was about protecting thousands of future residents from being poisoned. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. There were days when the sheer scale of it all felt like too much, when the temptation to just walk away would resurface. But then we would look at our father's photograph, or read a passage from our grandfather's letters, and the resolve would return, stronger than before. This was our purpose. It had been waiting for us, here in this dusty warehouse, all along. The turning point came on a sweltering afternoon in late August. A lawyer, a real one, showed up at our gate. Not from Apex. His name was Ben Carter, and he was young, sharp, and worked for a non-profit environmental law firm. He'd been tipped off by an anonymous source about potential groundwater contamination related to the Apex development. His research had led him to our father's old patents, and from there, to us. We were wary at first, remembering our grandfather's warning. But Ben was different. He didn't want anything from us. He wanted to help. We spent a day showing him everything, the letters, the notebooks, the prototypes. He was astounded. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "This is the smoking gun. With this, We don't just expose them, we stop them. For the first time, we weren't alone in the fight. We had an ally, someone who understood the language of the enemy and had the weapons to fight back. The battle had shifted from our rusty gate to the courtroom. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like a fight we could win. That evening, Maya and I stood at a newly cleaned window on the second floor of the warehouse, looking out at the setting sun. The light painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple, and it glinted off the rusted metal of our strange, beautiful home. It had been a little over a year since we had arrived here, two scared kids with nothing but a key and a desperate hope. We were still scared, but we weren't kids anymore, and we were no longer lost. We had found our place. We had found our purpose. We had found our home, not in a building, but in the fight to protect it and the legacy it held. The warehouse hadn't just changed us. It had forged us. The legal battle was a slow, grinding war of attrition. Apex threw everything they had at us. Their lawyers filed motion after motion, trying to drown us in paperwork, to bleed us dry. But with Ben and his firm on our side, we held the line. They tried to paint us as opportunistic squatters, as delusional kids spinning a fantasy. But we had the truth. We had our father's notebooks, our grandfather's letters, and the irrefutable science of the prototypes. The local community, which had watched us with cautious curiosity, rallied behind us. Mr. Henderson from the hardware store testified about the timeline of our repairs. Carol from the diner started a small fund at the counter to help with our living expenses. Martha, the town clerk, provided official records that corroborated my grandfather's story. We were no longer just the Vance kids. We were Oakhaven's kids. The town, forgotten and left behind for so long, saw in our fight a reflection of their own. A fight against a powerful, indifferent outside force that saw their home as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. Our story became their story. The climax wasn't a dramatic courtroom confession. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic settlement. Faced with the mountain of evidence Ben had compiled, and with a growing negative press from a few regional journalists who had picked up the story, Apex folded. They didn't admit guilt, of course. Corporations never do. But they abandoned the Oakhaven development project entirely. They paid a massive 8-figure sum into a trust for environmental cleanup of the region. And they transferred the full, unencumbered deed to the warehouse to us, along with a settlement that would ensure we would never have to worry about money again. We had won. We had protected our father's legacy, and in doing so, had saved a town. The day the news broke, the warehouse was flooded with people. Our neighbors, our friends. They brought food and music, and we had a party, a real celebration, under the high steel rafters of the main floor. Laughter echoed in the vast space that had once held only silence and grief. Standing in the middle of it all, watching Maya talk and laugh with people who genuinely cared about her, I felt a sense of peace so profound it almost brought me to my knees. We had done it. In the years that followed, we brought the warehouse to life. We used the settlement money to properly rewire and plumb the entire building. We replaced the roof, installed new energy-efficient windows, and polished the old concrete floors until they shone. But we kept the spirit of the place. The old workbenches stayed. The hulking machinery was cleaned and preserved, monuments to our grandfather's life of work. We turned the main floor into a combination of a community workshop and a business incubator, a place where the people of Oakhaven could come to learn, to build, to start their own small businesses. We wanted to give back to the town that had given us so much. And in the hidden cellar, we built a state-of-the-art laboratory. We founded the Vance Institute for Environmental Research, dedicated to developing and distributing our father's technology. We made sure his work would be open source, available to anyone, anywhere in the world who needed it. We fulfilled his dream. I'm telling you this story from the office in the back of the warehouse. It's bigger now, with a large window that looks out over the workshop floor, where a group of local high school students are learning to weld. Maya is down in the lab, leading a team of young scientists. The building is filled with the sounds of life, of creation, of hope. It's no longer just a warehouse. It's a home. It's a legacy. It's a future. Looking back, I realized that the $7 we paid for this place was the best investment we ever made. It wasn't a purchase of property. It was an act of faith. It was a belief that even in the most rusted, derelict, and forgotten places, something beautiful and strong can be built. Our grandfather didn't just leave us a building. He left us a choice to run from our past or to build a future from its ruins, a choice to accept the story we were given or to fight for the truth. If you've made it this far, thank you. This story is about a warehouse, but it's really about what it means to find your foundation when the world has tried to knock you off your feet. It's about understanding that the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property, but purpose. Have you ever had a moment in your life where you had to choose the harder right over the easier wrong? A moment where you had to stand and fight when everything in you wanted to run. I want you to know that you're not alone. This community we're building here is for people who understand that struggle, for people who are trying to build something meaningful out of the scraps they've been given. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. And more importantly, share your own story in the comments below. I read every one. Tell me about the warehouse in your life, the challenge, the burden, the unexpected inheritance that ended up defining you. Because every one of those stories deserves to be told. Thank you for listening.